Welcome back. Now we just finished implementing strafing and we took care of jog start and jog stop strafing animations. Now we're going to work on aiming and we would like to be able to aim and zoom in when we're aiming. So let's go ahead and get started. Now we need some sort of variable that will keep track of when we're aiming and when we're not aiming. And a Boolean is perfect for this. So let's go back into our shooter character class. Here in shooterCharacter.h, we're going to add a new private variable. So back down here in the private section at the bottom, we're going to add a Boolean, and I'm going to call this bAiming. Now we want this to have a uProperty, since we're going to expose it to blueprints. We're going to make this visible anywhere. We don't want to be able to edit this anywhere in the blueprints because this will be driven by whether or not we're aiming. And only button presses and mouse clicks will determine if we're aiming or not. It's going to be blueprint read only. And that's because we want to be able to read it from blueprints but not set it for the same reasons. Let's put it in category combat. And just like our other private variables, it needs this meta allow private access equals true property, since we want to access it using visible anywhere and blueprint read write. Now we need to initialize this to a default value, and the constructor is the place to do that. We're going to scroll up to our member initializer list here, where we initialized base turn rate and base lookup rate. We're going to place a comma and put our bAiming variable. We're going to initialize this to false by default. Now, we need functions that we can use to set bAiming to true or false based on when an aiming button is pressed or released. So in shooterCharacter.h, we'll create a couple of functions. Now, these functions can be protected, so we'll put them up here in the protected section, and they're going to be simple functions. They're just going to be void, and I'll call the first one aiming button pressed, and the second one, void aiming button released. And I'll go ahead and hover over and allow Visual Studio to give me definitions for these. And I'll just place a comment above the pair of these, and I'll comment them and say, set bAiming to true or false with button press. Now these functions are going to be quite simple. All they're going to do is set that Boolean to true or false. So I'm going to find them here. And for aiming button pressed, we're going to say bAiming is true. And for aiming button released, bAiming is false. Now we just need to set up inputs for the buttons we'd like to press that will set bAiming to true. So in the editor, we'll go to Edit, Project Settings, and Input, and this is going to be an action mapping because it's a one-off. We don't need to monitor this every frame. We just need to set the Boolean to true or false as soon as the button is pressed or released. So let's create a new action mapping, and let's call this aiming button. And for aiming, I'd like to use the right mouse button. So when we're holding the right mouse button, we're aiming. And let's use the gamepad left trigger as well. So our first one will be right mouse button, and then we'll add another one and we'll use gamepad left trigger. Because in most shooting games, you aim by holding the left trigger and then you shoot with the right. Okay, that takes care of the inputs. Now we need to bind these functions. So back here in shooter character, we'll go down to setup player input component and bind an action. Now since this bind action call is spanning too far, I'm going to go ahead and put it on 2 lines like this. Okay, so we need to bind the aiming button. I'm going to copy these 2 lines for the jump axis binding, paste them down here, and instead of jump, we're going to use aiming button. We're going to use that for both of these. And I'm going to go ahead and put these on 2 lines so you can see all the code. And for aiming button, we want to use our aiming button pressed function. So it's a shooter character aiming button pressed. And for released, we want a shooter character aiming button released. So that way, when we press our buttons, we'll get these functions called, which will set our Boolean to true or false, depending on whether we're pressing or releasing an aiming button. So that takes care of setting this Boolean. Now we need to actually use the Boolean to change our camera field of view so that we can zoom in. Now first we're going to create a private variable for our camera field of view. Let's go back to shooterCharacter.h, and in our private section, let's create a float called camera default FOV, and that's for field of view. And we'll give this a comment. We'll also give our be aiming a comment. We'll say true when aiming, and we'll give this a comment as well and say default camera field of view value. Now this will be the regular field of view value for our camera. Basically, how much of the world is the camera showing? Let's go into begin play, and we'll get that value from our follow camera. Because in begin play, our follow camera will be constructed by this time. So let's say if follow camera, then we'll say camera default FOV equals get follow camera, and we'll get its field of view. This is a variable on the uCamera component class. So begin play, we'll get our field of view right off the bat, that default value, and we'll store that. And the reason we're storing it is because we're going to have another value for when we're zoomed in. So back in shooterCharacter.h, we're going to create another float, and this will be the zoomed FOV. So camera zoomed FOV. And we'll give this a comment saying field of view value for when zoomed in. Now let's give these default values, and we'll do that in the constructor in the member initialization list. So we'll say camera default field of view, set that to 0 by default, and camera zoomed field of view, give that a default of 0. Now this isn't a good value, but we're just initializing it to 0 because we know in begin play we're going to get the follow camera's default field of view value and put it in there. But this is just so we have it initialized. Now for camera zoomed field of view, we're going to set that to a value of 60.f. And this is something that you can experiment with and find a value that works for you for your game. Now for camera default field of view, let's give this a comment right here and just say that we're setting this in begin play. That way we know that this will not remain 0. I believe the default value for the camera field of view is more like 90. Okay, so to finish this video off, we're going to change the field of view when we're aiming. Let's go ahead and go down into our functions that we created this lesson, aiming button pressed and aiming button released. And let's set the field of view here. So just under be aiming equals true and aiming button pressed, we're going to get follow camera, and we're going to call set field of view. This is a function on the uCamera component, and it takes a float. We're going to use camera zoomed FOV. And when aiming button is released, we're going to set it back to the default value. So we're going to set field of view to camera default FOV. Okay, we can compile this. And back in the editor, we'll hit play, and let's give this a try. Hold the right mouse button, and we zoom in. Now release it, and it looks like it's not zooming back out. Let's figure out why. Let's go back into our code, and the first thing I'm going to check is my bind action function call, and sure enough, there's a typo here, and this can happen when just copying and pasting things. When I pasted in aiming button in here, I didn't do this properly. It looks like part of the jump string was still there. Looks like I pasted it right in the middle of the jump string. So I need to go ahead and fix that so it says aiming button. And that's an important thing to keep in mind. If you don't put exactly the correct string here for the name you gave the axis mapping, it will not work. So I compiled this, and I'm back in the editor, and I'm going to aim, and I'm going to release the button, and I'm not aiming anymore. So we can zoom in and zoom out based on our mouse click. I've also got my controller here, my console controller, and I'm going to go ahead and hold the left trigger and release it, and it's working properly. All right, so this concludes this video. Now, you may not be satisfied with this because in games, generally when you aim, it doesn't just snap like this. It doesn't just snap to the zoomed in position. There's usually a smooth transition. It like zooms in sometimes quickly, but it's still smooth. So in the next video, we're going to make that happen. We're going to use interpolation so that we can zoom in a smooth manner so it's not just a jerk to the zoomed in position. So we'll see you in the next video.